Second Timothy chapter 1, starting in verse 15 to the end of the chapter. You are aware that all who are in Asia turned away from me, among whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly and found me. May the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day. And you well know all the service he rendered at Ephesus. So verse 15 kind of launches into a kind of a lonely little message, right? It's a lonely verse. It's, well, in his most needing hour, in the moment of his impending death, and he knew it was coming and it would come within a year, all in Asia have left him. All of those who seem to have been behind him at one point, who are the closest and who could have been giving him aid, could have been encouraging him, and they all, in his time of troubles, left. We don't really know why they all defected. Possibly it was due, and we've talked about this on other days, due to the stigma of their leader being in jail, and so they distanced themselves from him. Everybody but one family. There's bell graphs. Everybody likes a good bell graph, and I got to find my pen. And in these bell graphs, if you've ever seen one before, you see something like this. It's a curve, and it talks about people in society, and you realize even in the church, there is a small percentage, about 8%, that they are on board no matter what. If the pastor says it, they're on it. These aren't even early adapters. They are just there. They're the innovators. Sometimes they're the ones coming up with new ideas. And so you have this small innovator group. Innovator. And they typically, like I say, are about 8%. For easy math, we could say 10, but, about 8%. Then you have these early adapters. So we're talking change here. Innovators who they're good with change. They're jumping on it. They're probably even inventing it. Early adapters are about 15%, maybe 10, depending on your church, but 15% that are in this early adapter, and they're going to jump on board. When they see other people, when they see these innovators go, yes, we love it. Let's go. We're jumping with it. Then you have the hump. And this is generally about 60%. 60%, well, they're kind of on the verge. They're kind of skeptical. They don't really like change. And so often when change is happening, maybe their attendance backs down. Now, it's still their church. They're still going to stay there, but I just don't know if I can support. These are the unsures, they just don't really care for change. And then the same thing applies on the other end with about 10 to 15%, which are the late adapters. They do not like change, and they're going to fight it all the way through. But when 60% of the church begins to be on board with something, then they jump and they go. The problem is many late adapters, and then the won't adapts. And won't adapt is the final 8%. So you kind of get the end of that graph, and the late adapters and won't adapters. These are the ones that during a bit of change, during a building project, during changes to maybe seating in the sanctuary and colors, they'll leave your church. And they will leave. And what's ironic is they often go to churches that are already done with the change. They go to a church that, especially the late adapters, they'll go to a church where they've already got chairs. Let's say that's the issue instead of pews. And then 6 months to a year down the road, they come back and they act like they never left. We saw this in a church building project. We were in a church that was meeting on the property of another church and had been for years, and that was comfortable. We've been talking about that on Sundays, haven't we? Choosing the cross over the comfort, but it was comfortable. And so when we started our building project and asked people to give, and then we're in this process of building, they didn't like it. They were going to have to leave their new building, and they left. They left the church for over a year. Now, in this time, we had moved to another state. I had joined as an executive pastor of another church, but was invited back during the ceremonies. We had been there for the groundbreaking, and then when the church was done and their first Sunday, the soft Sunday, and kind of their party, they invited us back. And so we go back, and wouldn't you know it, people that we had not seen at that church for over a year were back, and they stayed. They couldn't go through. They couldn't go through it was too uneasy, too difficult to go through the change. But once the change is done, hey, this has always been our church and we're back. That's how people are. And so some of these individuals, it doesn't tell us that they necessarily left the faith. They just left Paul's side. We see that even in difficult times in a church, don't we? When a pastor maybe is going through struggles and we see individuals who had been right along with them leaving their side because, well, they don't want to be connected with that. Instead of fighting for what's right, standing up for what's right. I don't mean fighting, right? We talked about that on Sunday too, that God fights our battles for us if we just stand still and be silent, and then when he tells us to move, we move. Timothy, we know, stayed, but in the area of Asia, we know that this family, the Onesiphorus and his family stayed. They stayed by Paul's side through the difficulty, through the tough, through the rough association with Paul during this time. They stayed. Opposition is hard to handle. Opposition, especially in ministry or on a ministry team or as a board or any of that, it's hard to handle when people, we want people to like us. We want people to like our church. We want people to see what God's doing, and yet sometimes they don't. And that's not on us. As long as we're following God, it's not on us, but it's hard. It's difficult. And you can see that from Paul here, that he was lonely. Especially when it comes from people that you think are friends, that are walking alongside you, fellow workers, colleagues. And having a discussion to seek to fix matters, often we find that the individuals that are leaving, that there's sometimes a lack of humility, that there's a lack of health, a lack of an ability to listen. They don't like to have authority over them. I've watched in numerous churches as people have left to start their own churches. And it's primarily because they didn't want to listen. They didn't want to come under authority. The last church we were at, we saw both sides of it. One who didn't want to come under authority, and one who, when they said they wanted to plant a church, the pastor said, give me 1 year to pray about it. And 1 year later, they announced it to the congregation, and we sent them out in style with people. About 150 people went with them. About $15,000 a month in giving went with them. And we sent them out in a blessing because they were willing to wait, to trust God's timing, trust this time of prayer, so that they went out in the right way. Each church modeled this. They modeled this idea of growing together, this humility and health in our councils. As you look back at the ecumenical councils of the early church, these were not a one-day weekend event. Our general conferences every 4 years as a Nazarene church or Wesleyan or other denominations generally are like a weekend event. We try to solve all the problems of the world in a weekend. It doesn't work that way. But they're often, these councils were long. They were long running. They were full of discussion and debate and prayer. They'd last weekends and months, and sometimes the items would carry over for decades until they were finally resolved at another council. We see this. So, first in Acts, you read about these were pre-ecumenical councils. What that meant was they were local areas, one group that got together. So we see the Council of Jerusalem, that's in Acts, and that was in about AD 50. And then there are 12 other local pre-ecumenical councils that are trying to deal with things in the faith of like monotonism and other heresies that had come up in the first couple hundred years of the church. And we have great things like the Didache and other resources that come from them. By the way, if you want to know how to deal with heresies today, like what we see in the Mormon Church or Jehovah's Witness and others, you just look back to these early councils. Nothing's new under the sun. It's the same thing they were dealing with then. And then they came together under the First Council of Nicaea. Lasted from May 20th to June 19th in 325. First Council of Constantinople, 381. The Council of Ephesus, Council of Chalcedon, Second and Third Council of Chalcedons, right? Second Council of Nicaea. And all of these had ecumenical. They brought in pastors and individuals from all over the Christian world, and they would discuss heresies and things that were being preached. During that time, it was okay to be called a heretic. It was, because the idea was that you were stretching belief, because they were still trying to form what meant. They were trying to form boundaries. And the first few councils dealt with the Trinity. If Jesus is human and God, how does that work? Because if God can't be around sin, and humanity in the flesh is sin, right? So therefore, that's what they thought. And so therefore, well, God has to be fully God, and Jesus was fully God and not human. And it was kind of like a holographic Jesus. He wasn't really here in bodily form. But then there's verses that the piercing in his sides and his hands and the blood flow and all these humanity things that, well, that can't be fully true. And so they went to the other end of he just fully kicked out everything to do with God and was fully man. Well, but if that's the case, then that's where the Mormons get the idea that he was just the best created. He just was, the first one to attain to godhood. And so therefore we can all be like that, and we all can be gods ourselves. Okay. And they're like, wait, no, we went too far this way. We went too far this way. Let's come, no. And then they finally came up with this, what? He's fully God. He's 100% God, 100% man. And while that doesn't work mathematically, it works in God. He is fully God, fully man. That's how they described it. And so all of this were in these early councils where they brought in, they never had less than about 150 people, and some of them had up to 500 people that would come together for over a month, if not longer, to discuss these things and come up with statements to help teach others. Because their point wasn't to necessarily kick somebody out of the church and call them a heretic. Their point was to say, okay, well, you're preaching over here and maybe you went too far. So let's discuss this and let's come up with a statement of belief. Now, the heretic, the one who was called heretic, has the ability to say, you know what? I agree with that. I'm going to balance what I preach. Or they just, in the case of Arius and a couple others, they just said, no, I don't believe in that. And they went off. And we see other issues because of that. That's what the councils did. They came under humility. They came under the church, and they worked together to form the belief. Sometimes the decisions didn't leave room for debate. The confessing church used this later on during World War II with the German occupations and the German murder of the Jews and genocide and all of that. And in 1930, they wrote down, I guess that would have been World War I time, but 1930 had the statement of the confessing church of, if you are a part of the church, you will not do this. Hitler is wrong. End of discussion. Asia is who Paul says they've left him. Asia was modern Turkey. Ephesus, one of the church councils, was among the key cities, and they all were distancing themselves from Paul. Paul may have felt failure in that moment. He spent a lot of time in Ephesus. Ephesus had had a lot of issues. They were one of the first to fall. He spent a lot of time teaching and praying and weeping and laughing and living among them, and now they turned from him. Now, he may not have, like I said, meant turning from their faith, but they turned from Paul's side. They had lost the saving gospel. They had lost the cutting edge gospel. They had lost the gospel message that made them different from the world around them. They were choosing their comfort over the cross of Christ. One of the reasons Paul kind of points this out is in that day, it wasn't like here in America that prisoners were not taken care of by the state. They weren't guaranteed food. They weren't guaranteed things. And so Paul relied on the churches and the people to support him. And they'd left him. They'd abandoned him. Paul begins to find that the cross of Jesus Christ is lonely. The cross of Jesus Christ is a lonely place when we follow it. Jesus even said it, right? No one who loves his father and mother. He didn't mean that we couldn't love other people. That when we put other things above the cross, comfort, even our family's health and well-being. I've mentioned before books like Fox's Book of Martyrs, and there's one, DC Talk years ago put out a couple books that were that type of thing as well. And one of them, I remember the story of a pastor in Asia who they dug a hole. And they put his entire family in the hole by gunpoint. And they slowly filled the dirt back in. And he had to watch one by one as each of his family members suffocated, ending with him. The parent would have broke in that moment, right? Somebody who didn't trust the hope of eternity, who didn't trust the salvation of their family. What leads an individual into the lion's den? What leads an individual into the fiery furnace? The only thing is that trust in Jesus Christ, knowing that no matter what the outcome, it's for his glory and his plan, and that we seek first his kingdom. Nothing. We sang it yesterday. Nothing else matters. Doesn't mean we don't love our family. Doesn't mean we don't love our jobs. Doesn't mean that we don't love our house. But we don't put it above our love of whatever God asks of us. because he has you covered. That's right, Pam. God covers us. There's a song coming to my mind right now, and I don't know why. Yesterday I mentioned this author or artist as well, and he hasn't been around in a long time, but Steve Camp. And he had a song that said, "When you're alone, your heart is torn. He is all you need. He is all you need." Is God really all we need? It's a challenging thought if you really sit and think about it. Is God all you need? If, like Job, in an instant, everything was taken from you, would you find yourself mad at God? Or trusting? Yeah, all we need, but not always all we want. That's right. So may He be all we ever need and want. May He be the one that we lean on, run to, fall to. God, we confess we're not always so focused on you that you're all we need. We get caught up in routines of mornings. We run from one thing to the next. We forget devotions, or we throw devotions in a 5-minute time, and you know, forgive us. May you be all we need. All our wants, our desires are all found in you. May we surrender more and more and more each day. Because, God, we want to be a people that leave nothing on the table. We want to be a people that just our lives intentionally exude your love, your grace to everyone we meet. Not for our legacies. I get tired of hearing colleges and other places talking about leaving a legacy. God, I could care less if my name ever leaves a legacy. But may our lives lead a legacy for you, that you be remembered, not us. Because you're all that matters. Be with us this week. Lord, restore joy to those who need joy. Restore strength to those who need strength. Lord, restore prayer to those that need to pray more. Restore hope. We love you. We praise you. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we ask it. Amen. Amen. Well, go in peace and hope you have a great rest of the day.